Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I noticed it at my mother's birthday dinner in March. We were at the kitchen table, 6 of us, and Colt was sitting at the end closest to the back window. And at some point during the meal, I glanced over at him and he was smiling at the window. Not at anything outside the window, not at a person or an animal in the yard, just at the window itself, or at something very close to the glass, smiling the way you smile at someone who has just said something that landed well. I looked at the window. There was nothing there. Colt came back to the conversation naturally, without any break in the flow, and nobody else seemed to have noticed. My mother was telling a story about the neighbor's dog, and everyone was listening, and the moment passed. But I'd seen it. My name is Fen Grabble, and I pour and finish concrete for a living, residential flat work mostly. Driveways and patios and shop floors, occasionally a larger commercial job when the season required it. I've been doing it for 13 years, and the work had made me practical in the way that physical trade work makes a person practical, focused on what's in front of me, interested in what's actual rather than what's theoretical. Colt was my younger brother by 4 years, a carpenter who did custom millwork and cabinet installation, and who had the particular patience for fine detail that I'd never developed. We were close in the way of siblings who grew up in the same house and then continued to choose each other as adults, which is a different kind of close than just being related. I called him the week after the birthday dinner and asked him about it directly, because that's how we talk to each other. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said there had been a woman standing by the window. He said she'd been there most of the evening, moving around the edges of the room, and that she'd said something that he'd found funny. I asked him who she was. He said he didn't know her name, but that she was familiar. He said there were a few of them he saw regularly, people who appeared in places he spent time, who seemed to know him, who he'd been getting used to seeing over the past few months. He said he knew it sounded wrong and that he'd been trying to decide whether to say anything. I asked him if he was worried about it. He said no. He said they seemed fine, seemed normal, seemed like ordinary people going about ordinary things, just present in places where other people couldn't see them. I told him I'd look into it. He said okay, which was how he always responded when I told him I was going to handle something, with the specific trust of a younger sibling who had been trusting his older brother's handling of things for 30 years. The neighborhood we'd grown up in, where my mother still lived, and where Colt rented a house 2 streets over, was an older residential area in the eastern part of the city. I'd grown up in it without thinking much about it, the way you grow up in a place without examining it, and I knew it practically, the streets and the drainage patterns and the soil conditions, and on which yards had settling problems because of what was underneath them. What was underneath a section of the neighborhood, I found out when I started looking carefully, was a geological feature that the city's survey records described as a subsidence-prone stratum along a northeast running line that crossed through the back of the older residential blocks. The survey records were about the soil and the drainage risk and nothing else, but the line the survey records described matched exactly with the area where Colt's house sat, and where my mother's house sat, and where we'd grown up. I didn't know what to do with that information specifically, but it was a place to start, and I started there. The thin place was in the lot behind Colt's house. The lot had been undeveloped for as long as I could remember, overgrown and scrubby. The kind of city lot that occasionally got mowed and more often didn't. I'd played in it as a kid, and Colt had played in it. And as adults, we'd used it as a shortcut occasionally without thinking about it. Standing in it on a Thursday evening in April, I understood what it was. The air had a quality I recognized from descriptions I'd read when I'd been trying to understand what was happening to my brother. A specific density, a thickness that wasn't weather or atmosphere, but something structural. A place where the distance between two versions of the same location had compressed to almost nothing. It wasn't visible. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a section of scrubby city lot that felt different from the sections around it. And once you knew what you were feeling for, you couldn't unfeel it. I stood in the lot for a while, and then a woman came around the back of what should have been the empty lot, and she stopped when she saw me, and I stopped when I saw her. She was maybe 50, wearing work clothes, and she was carrying a bag of gardening tools, and she was standing in the lot the way a person stood in their own yard, because from her side of the thin place, it was her own yard. We looked at each other. She said, "You can see me." I told her I could. She said most people from my side couldn't. She said Colt could, had been able to for some time, and that she and the others who knew the thin place had been aware of him, watching from across the boundary since his permeability had started increasing. I asked her how long the permeability had been increasing. She said several months, which matched what I'd been seeing at my mother's birthday dinner and the dinners before it, that I hadn't been paying close enough attention to notice. I asked her about the childhood crossing, about Colt at 8 years old. She looked at me with the expression of a person confirming information they already had. She said yes. She said a boy had come through the thin place about 20 years ago and spent the better part of an afternoon on their side before finding his way back. She said they'd been aware of him ever since, the way you were aware of someone who had briefly been part of your landscape, and that when his permeability had started increasing, they'd recognized it as the same person. I asked her if they'd been drawing him back. She said no. She said the thinning of the boundary was doing that on its own. She said the thin place had been getting thinner for several years, and Colt's permeability had increased in proportion, and that if the thinning continued to completion, Colt would be pulled fully through, not because anyone was pulling him, but because the crossing was completing the circuit the childhood crossing had opened. She said she was sorry. She said she'd known it was coming and hadn't known how to communicate it across the boundary. I said I appreciated the honesty. I called Colt that night and told him what I'd found. I told him about the thin place in the lot and about the woman and about what she'd said about the childhood crossing. He was quiet on the phone for a long time. Then he said he remembered that afternoon. Not clearly, not in detail, just the impression of it, an afternoon when the lot had seemed different, when he'd gone into the scrubby trees at the back edge and come out somewhere that was the same but not the same, the way dreams used a familiar geography and made it strange. He said he'd been there, and then he'd come back and he hadn't known how to explain it and hadn't told anyone. I asked him how he'd come back. He said he'd heard me calling his name. I remembered that afternoon. I'd been 12 and he'd been 8, and I'd come looking for him because our mother wanted him inside for dinner, and I'd gone to the lot and called his name from the edge of it twice, and he'd come out of the trees looking vague and muddy and unable to tell me where he'd been. I'd called his name, and he'd come back. The woman's name was Ord. I met her again in the lot the following evening, and we talked for about an hour, working through what was happening and what might address it. She understood the mechanics of the thin place better than I did, having lived adjacent to it for decades, and I understood my brother better than she did. What emerged from the conversation was a picture I could work with. The childhood crossing had opened a connection in Colt that had never fully closed, a permeability to the thin place that had stayed low and dormant for most of his life. As the boundary had thinned in recent years, the permeability had activated, and the more the boundary thinned, the more present the other side had become to him. The anchor that had brought him back at 8 years old was specific. Not just his name, not just my voice. The pull of an older brother calling from this side of the boundary. A specific relational connection. The kind of tie that had weight and direction. It had been enough to orient him toward home when he was a child. Ord said she thought if the anchor was re-established clearly enough, with enough intention, it might stabilize the thin place rather than just pulling Colt back temporarily. It might give the crossing point something to hold against, a counterweight, reducing the thinning rather than just resisting its effects. I asked her how clearly she meant. She said as clearly as possible. She said the anchor had worked 20 years ago by accident. If it worked by intention, it might hold. Colt came to the lot that Saturday morning. We went together, which felt like the right way to do it. He moved through the lot with the ease of someone returning to a familiar place, which the lot had always been, and in the back section near the thin place, he stopped and stood still, and I could tell from his expression that the other side was very present to him, in a way it probably hadn't been in an open space before. The density of the thin place from up close. Ord was there on her side. She could see both of us, I thought, though from my side I could only barely make her out, a slight thickening in a section of the air that I'd learned to read as presence. Colt looked toward her for a long moment. Then he turned to me. I said his name. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just said it the way I'd said it 1,000 times over 30 years. The specific way an older brother said a younger brother's name. With the weight of all the times before it, I said it and I meant it as an anchor, meant it as a direction, meant it as a here rather than there, this world rather than the other one, this street and this lot and this family that was his. He looked at me. The air in the lot changed. Not dramatically, not with any event you could point to. The density at the thin place shifted, not closing exactly, but settling. The way a door settles when it's properly hung and the latch engages, finding a position it was meant to hold. Colt let out a breath. He said it felt different. He said the other side was still there, still faintly present, but it had moved back. The way something moves back when there's a clear boundary between it and where you're standing. I put my hand on his shoulder and kept it there for a minute, and we stood in the lot in the morning light. Ord was gone from the air. The thin place was still there, but quiet, the way the lot had always been quiet, just scrubby city land doing nothing in particular. The weeks after that were adjustment. Colt still saw things occasionally, at the edges. Not often, not clearly. He said it was like something he'd had a full view of being reduced to peripheral vision. Present, but not demanding attention. Background rather than foreground. He said he was getting used to it. I asked him if he missed it, the full permeability, the clarity of seeing the other side. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about things. He said yes and no. He said it had been interesting in the way that something you didn't choose but had to manage was sometimes interesting, but that he'd also been aware for the past few months of a pull he hadn't liked, a quality of the thin place drawing on him in a way that made him feel less than fully present in his own life. He said the settling had taken that away, and that was worth whatever the other thing cost. I told him that sounded right to me. He said it was good to have an older brother who called his name. I didn't say anything to that because I didn't need to. I drove past the lot about 3 weeks later on the way to a job site, a morning delivery run for materials that took me through the neighborhood. I was watching the traffic and not thinking about the lot, and when I passed it, I glanced over the way you glanced at a familiar place, automatic, just registering the geography. For 1 second, the lot was not just the lot. For 1 second, there was another version of it laid over the top, another yard behind another version of the house, a garden bed along one edge, and a woman moving through it in the morning with a bag of tools, her face turned away, going about her work in the ordinary way of someone starting a day. Then it was the lot, the scrubby, undeveloped lot it had always been on my side, the overgrown city parcel, nothing remarkable. I drove onto the job site and thought about it on the way. That was what Colt had been seeing for months. That overlay, that other world laid just over the top of this one, present and detailed and inhabited. I'd seen it for 1 second at the highway speed, and it had been enough to understand the pull of it, the specific quality of a world that was right there, visible, real, just on the other side of a boundary you could feel but not touch. I understood why he'd smiled.